Hey guys, welcome here. In this lecture I explain you differences between var, const and a let, and I showed you ternary operator. In this lecture we'll continue and we'll be talking about scoping. Let's start, open your coding editors and we'll comment code from last lecture, so this code, and I will paste here some code and you can find this code in the resources of this lecture. Okay, so we can actually do it down here in our code. So let's go down here and let's paste here this code you can find in the resources of this lecture. And let's write debugger here. And let's inspect these functions and let's talk about scoping. All right, so let's save this. Let's write debugger in before we are calling function A. And let's go back to our browsers. All right, let's refresh this and let's see. All right, let's wait. We'll jump into our code. All right, so let's see. We are in before calling function A, and I'll jump on a function A execution. Let's click here, step into next function call. We are jumping into a function A. All right, and I am assigning to a scope variable as scope, and this should be a scope string, but doesn't matter. All right, so this should be a scope string, and I'm consoling log out here a scope, where you can see a scope is defined here, and global scope is also defined here. So when I will hover over global scope, I should see here global scope. So this is scoping. As you can see, here is our function, and function a scope applies to all this block. All this block apply scope of a function A. So when I will declare a variable inside of the function A, I can use them in function B here and also inside of this if block. All right, when I will define global scope, so when I will define variables outside of the function here, so let's call it global scope, I can access this variable in every spot on my function A. So I can access it here, access it in function B, I can access it in if block, everywhere inside of a function A. All right, so here we have a scope, global scope. Okay, you can see now they will be visible. I can console log them out. Now we are going inside of the if block. If block has its own scope. All right, so when I will declare a variable inside of the if block, I can use them only inside of the if block. All right, so let's continue execution. Now I am defining here variable if scope, and I'm assigning here if scope value. So you can see if scope is a if scope, and now I want to console log out a scope, and of course I have access to a scope because a scope was defined in a function A, and I told you this applies to all function. All right, let's continue with this, and now let's try to access global scope. Yes, we have access to global scope, but now let's try to access B scope. You can see here is a B scope. It's actually commented out, but I can go to console log and I can write here B scope. And you will see, actually B scope, and you will see B scope is not defined. So I don't have access in my if block to a B scope, even though it's defined on the function B here. All right, so B scope I will have available only in this function. So one more time, global scope applies to all in everything here. All right, the whole scope here. Our a scope applies in everything inside of a function A, so inside of here. Okay, this apply to our function B, to our if block. All right. Our function B scope applies only to function B. Okay, so in anything I will define in function B, it will apply the scope only to function B. So all of my variables are visible only here, but they are not visible outside of a function B. Same applies to if block here. When I will declare here some variables, they are only visible inside of this if block. All right, so where we are now, so let's see here we are inside of our if statement. So I can console log out here global scope, and now I'm going to function B. So I will press here this down arrow, and you will see I have access to my A scope and a global scope here. I will declare here a variable called B scope. So now I declare B scope, so I have access to a B scope, but I don't have access here to my if scope here, so I cannot access here if scope, and I will access here if scope. This will throw an error, so you can see if scope is not defined, but I can access here my global scope and my A scope without any problems. All right, and again, if I will define in a B function some if statement, maybe I can access their B scope, but outside of the if statement, I cannot access my variables I declare in an if statement. So maybe let's see short examples. So for example, when I will declare here if statement, if 2 is larger than 3, and I will console log out here our B scope. So I'll console log out here this B scope, and I will declare here new variables. So let's say const if scope, all right, and then let's say this will be if scope. I will try to console log out here, that's without any problems, but when I will try to console log out if scope outside of the if block, so let's say console log here, my if scope, this will not work. All right, so let's write the debugger actually, let's write it here. And let's say here not 2 is larger than 3, but 2 is larger than 1. Okay, so it will pass. Okay, let's save this now. Let's go back to our browsers. Let's refresh this. All right, let's continue execution, and now let's see. So here we have in 2 is larger than 1. We have here access to our B scope and an if scope, but not yet because we need to assign its value. Okay, so now we have access to B scope, if scope. All right, let's see if I cannot see if scope. That's interesting. I think I have an if scope. Let's see. All right, it's actually working. I don't know what's happened. I am consoling log out here if scope. You can see. All right, just my browser is confused. All right, and when I will try to console log out if scope outside of a if block, this will throw an error. Right, so you will see now. I'll throw an error. Let's see it. If scope is not defined. So this guys is scoping. So as I told you, global scope applies on everything instead of a function A here, and also outside of this function. A scope applies only function A, and everything inside of a function. Function B scope applies only to function B, and everything what is defined in function B. When I will declare some variables in function B, I cannot use them outside of this function, for example here. All right, anything inside of the if statements applies only to if statements. Same applies for for loops. All right, so for loops also applies to scope only inside of the for loop, not outside. All right, guys, so I think that should be it from this lecture. And that should be actually last lecture before we'll start working on actual application in Vue. So guys, thank you for your patience. These lectures were really long, but I just wanted to make sure that you understand every concept before we'll start working on a Vue application. So one more time, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you in the next lectures where we'll start working on actual Vue application. Cheers guys, and see you there!